Donkey Kong surely has to be Nintendo's most underrated, iconic character. Despite being the lead character of the game that first launched Mario into the world, it ended up being the jovial Jumpman and not the irascible ape who has come to headline Nintendo's lineup over the years. But now that the Switch era is bringing Nintendo back to prominence, now that the movies have made Donkey Kong a household name once again, it's time to look at the future of this venerable franchise. Looking at the numbers, what potential does Donkey Kong have as a property? Why is it seemingly underperforming? And what path is there back to video gaming glory? We'll look at the likely developers of a new title and even what kind of game might see the great ape rise from the doldrums. Hit like and subscribe for me and settle in for a Nintendo Forecast deep dive into the Donkey Kong franchise. So firstly, let's be clear, Donkey Kong was not always some niche little franchise. It's easy to forget this in an era when the last major Donkey Kong title was over a decade ago and released on the low-selling Wii U, but Donkey Kong was once a very powerful brand indeed. Of the top 10 games by sales numbers on the Super Nintendo Entertainment System, we have at number 3 Donkey Kong Country with 9.3 million sales, and at number 6, Diddy Kong's Quest with 5.15 million. Now you may say, okay, these numbers are inflated because the titles were pack-ins with the system. Well, what about the final game then, Donkey Kong Country 3 Dixie Kong's Double Trouble, a game that released months after the Super NES had been superseded by the N64 on the market, and which was never a pack-in but still ranks as the 11th best-selling Super Nintendo Entertainment System game, the 9th best-selling first-party title on the system, with 3.51 million units sold. There's no sane reason that a title released so late in the lifespan of the system, a second sequel in a series that had already seen recent entries, not even necessarily the best received of the Donkey Kong Country titles critically, should do so incredibly well, except that there was a hunger for these titles. In fact, if you look in terms of the games driving Nintendo sales for the mid-90s, it was very significantly Donkey Kong and not Mario, partly, granted, because Nintendo pulled back on quite so regular Mario platformers after Super Mario World, but the pro-Kong pattern repeats on other consoles as well. On N64, DK64 and Diddy Kong Racing are the 7th and 8th biggest selling titles respectively, ahead of Zelda Majora's Mask, Mario Party, Pokemon Snap, and Banjo-Kazooie. Donkey Kong was not a small-time franchise, but a legitimate hit. Of course, we all know what happened next. The developers who had really led the way in reviving Donkey Kong as a going concern were Rare, and Rare was sold to Microsoft in 2002. Now, Nintendo generally is skeptical of buying out companies, and perhaps in 2002, a relative nadir in their fortunes compared to the DS and Wii eras that would follow later that decade, they did not feel themselves able to be competitive in a bidding war back then to secure Rare's future with Nintendo. Their Donkey Kong Racing game was scrapped, 30 employees left, but Rare became a Microsoft developer and Donkey Kong's future was thrown into turmoil. But Nintendo had an immediate plan for the Great Ape, and it was to be led by someone who is now incredibly senior in the Nintendo company, Yoshiaki Koizumi. I have a separate video in the works deep diving this, but essentially Koizumi-san and a whole bunch of staff members, chiefly from the Super Mario Sunshine team, had just left Nintendo's longtime home of Kyoto to set up a studio in Tokyo. This was a chance partly to tap into the growing Tokyo development team and do things that were original, and to try and branch out and have different influences from the rest of Nintendo, who remained largely Kyoto-based. Their debut title, Donkey Kong Jungle Beat, was always intended as a modest title to get the team moving, and get them moving it did. The team ended up having to rush the title out of the door for December 2004, but it nevertheless proved a great bonding exercise for the neophyte team, who would go on to lead every Super Mario title from Super Mario Galaxy onward. I can find no reliable evidence for how Jungle Beat sold, but it seems to be less than 1 million units. The fact that it was intended to work with the Donkey Kong bongos probably didn't help matters, and while it may have inflated sales of this peripheral, it probably also alienated the core audience of prior Donkey Kong titles who are not necessarily looking for barrel-blasting gimmicks, but a core platform experience that offered challenge alongside great graphics. Either way, a quick-to-make and quick-to-play title from a different team than the one that had piloted the original Donkey Kong Country games didn't capture the imagination of players who loved the Country series, and of course the GameCube's smaller install base probably didn't help. But Nintendo weren't done with Donkey Kong, and in 2010, under the watchful eye of Retro Studios, the Banana Hoarder bounced back with 6.53 million sales for Donkey Kong Country Returns, launching as a major holiday title in 2010, still on the popular Wii, but after the buzz around the system had started to dissipate. The 16th best-selling title, it wasn't quite Super NES numbers, but it was still a good showing, in front of titles like Animal Crossing City Folk, Zelda Skyward Sword, and Mario Party 9. The 5th and final country title debuted on Wii U and was the 11th place title on that system, although, because of the Wii U's derisory console sales numbers, it only could count 2.02 million sales to its name. I will say that I think Retro Studios was a particularly good choice of studio to revive Donkey Kong Country, and not just because it's clear that they are, or at least were in the early part of the century, outrageously talented, but they are also close in spirit, I feel, to Rare, in that they are a Western developer with an appreciation for things that seem to have more appeal in the West, such as a very high graphical fidelity. They also have a slightly eccentric sense of humour, and while perhaps not to the same degree as Rare, who had villains talking entirely in rhyme, nobody can take Returns and Donkey Kong Tropical Freeze's quirky charm away from them. In the Switch era, we've had 2 Donkey Kong Country games, but both are fairly bare-bones ports. I think the fact that they dropped Donkey Kong Country Returns as a late-in-life reprise for Donkey Kong is curious. On the one hand, Nintendo has a minor habit of remakes to lay the groundwork for bigger titles to come, part of their seeming warm-up marketing. They released Luigi's Mansion on 3DS the year before Luigi's Mansion 3 came to Switch, and Metroid Prime Remastered feels like a way to build anticipation for Metroid Prime 4. Still, a very bare-bones Forever Entertainment port does not feel like Donkey Kong is in the anticipation game, but rather the afterthought game. They may remind people of the franchise and that it exists, but I question what kind of groundwork Returns, great game though it is, represents as a launchpad for a new title. Certainly compared to the effort put into Metroid Prime, it feels like very much an afterthought. As I've gone through, I have of course skipped over a whole raft of other titles, from bongo bouncing Donkey Konga to the classic Donkey Kong titles reincarnated as the Mario vs Donkey Kong series. The latter is of particular interest, being shepherded by an American Nintendo studio. No, not Retro Studios, who on Donkey Kong Country, Mario vs Donkey Kong has always been the preserve of Nintendo Software Technologies, a team who have in the past taken on fairly major projects in their own right, including Metroid Prime Hunters, Wave Race, and the doomed Project Hammer, but in recent years have been mainly focused on port work, such as bringing over Super Mario 3D World to the Switch, alongside a few smaller projects such as the Mario vs Donkey Kong games and F-Zero 99. I have seen it speculated that Nintendo Software Technology would make an ideal studio to shepherd Donkey Kong, given that they are a Western studio, and Donkey Kong has generally been more successful in Western hands, and they already handle the Mario vs Donkey Kong games. However, with only 2 people from Tropical Freeze crossing over to support on Mario vs Donkey Kong, there is not much evidence that there's a lot of cross-pollination between Retro Studios and Nintendo Software Technologies. Given that NST still seem to have a smaller size, I'm not sure at this point it's something I can see happening. Also, while I would have had high hopes of this outcome, the announcement that it's Forever Entertainment behind the Returns port hurts my optimism quite a bit. You see, Nintendo Software Technologies has a history of porting big titles for Nintendo over recent years. Nintendo aren't going to give Super Mario 3D World to just anybody after all. Just like Grezzo, Mercury Steam and Mages, these would make obvious partners to a remake of a banner title to really get to grips with the mechanics of a Donkey Kong Country game, and then go on to do an original sequel utilising the resources they built and the experience they've gained. None of that is likely to happen with Forever Entertainment, a studio focused on remakes rather than innovation. In fact, the terms of the Forever Entertainment and Nintendo partnership specifically specified that they would be focusing on port work and not developing original titles. As for Nintendo Software Technology, I wouldn't rule them completely out of contention from being involved in Donkey Kong for reasons we'll see in a second, but I definitely think the chances that they're going to lead development of a new title have taken a big hit from the fact that Donkey Kong Country Returns went to Forever and not to NST. In many ways, the most promising development studio for Donkey Kong would be the team that made the first Donkey Kong Country trilogy, plus Diddy Kong Racing, Donkey Kong 64 and others, the beloved Rare, but they are now owned by Microsoft. Or are they? Nintendo, remember, prioritizes partnerships with people rather than companies, and many of the Rare staff of yore have now flown the nest, most notably to set up Yooka-Laylee development team Playtonic Games. It strikes me as unlikely that Playtonic themselves would return to the Donkey Kong fold, despite the fact that Yooka-Laylee clearly owes a lot to Banjo-Kazooie, which in itself owed a lot to Donkey and Diddy. Financially, teaming up on Donkey Kong with Nintendo probably makes a lot of sense. Yooka-Laylee celebrated 1 million players by the end of 2018, but this is a slightly misleading way to talk about its success. That would presumably include people playing demos, for example, plus it doesn't account for the price it was sold at. Even if a Yooka-Laylee game was capable of selling 2 million to a potential Donkey Kong title's at least 3 million, the odds are that the Donkey Kong title would sell at close to full price for its entire run, while the Yooka-Laylee title would be sold for significantly less. Even accounting for what I'm sure would be Nintendo's hefty margins, compared to Yooka-Laylee being owned outright by Playtonic, the profit argument for developing a Donkey Kong game is surely pretty much beyond contention. What stops Playtonic may partly be the lack of any remaining strong relationship with Nintendo, but also, I'm sure, a wish by Playtonic themselves to remain independent and to have control over their own creations, which is something I absolutely applaud. Still, Playtonic are not the only game in town when it comes to ex-country devs. From Makin Games, a tiny studio which created the arcade-style beat-em-up Raging Justice, to Blue Dot Games, who are creating the so-called accessible realism-based first-person shooter 83, Rare staff from back in the day are now scattered to the winds. There's Brendan Gunn, the technical director of several Kong titles. He appears to have left Rare several years ago after working on 2014's Kinect Sports Rivals, and his only credit since has been early playtesting on Raging Justice, presumably as a favour for old friends rather than a substantial career move. His social media feed identifies him as working at Straight 4 Studios, a team dedicated to racing sim games. Donkey Kong Country 3 programmer Trevor Atwood appears from his LinkedIn profile to have moved out of games entirely, claiming to be working as a consultant for US-based company eGlobal Fairs to develop a cross-border payment system website. Then there's Steve Horsberg, who appears to have left Rare, but for where, I'm not sure. All of these people are well outside the orbit of Nintendo, and individually it seems unlikely that there's any path back to the fold without the backing of a fairly significant studio who could pitch Nintendo a Donkey Kong Country title. It's not impossible that a Rare veteran could step up, but sadly the dreams of a Rarevival are probably, at this point, ill-conceived. Another potential game development studio that once seemed primed to take on the mantle of Donkey Kong, but has barreled away in recent years, is Minnesota-based Monster Games, the talented team who ported Donkey Kong Country Returns to the 3DS and helped on Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze. Sadly for Nintendo, Monster Games have decidedly moved on from Nintendo projects, focusing on racing games for the PlayStation and Xbox. Given the cadence of these releases, it strikes me as unlikely that Monster would return to the Nintendo fold anytime soon, especially since in 2022 the company was acquired by iRacing.com Motorsport Simulations, a company which seems absolutely aligned with their newer racing-focused iteration and not their Nintendo porting past. I also suspect that Donkey Kong was never Monster Games' major passion, as their Nintendo partnership began with the Wii-era revival of the Excite franchise, and once those games dried up, they were being tasked with ever more abstruse franchise tasks. If you came into gaming to make absolutely amazing racing titles, it is not immediately clear to me how your talents and passions are best utilised by developing Xenoblade Chronicles 3D. Don't get me wrong, Xenoblade Chronicles is an amazing title, but I have to wonder whether Nintendo, who have a rather rocky history with racing titles as this past video of mine delves into, really valued what Monster Games could do. In this case, their association with Donkey Kong was probably a marriage of convenience rather than passion, and I suspect that the studio is a lot happier now developing the kind of racing games they seem to be working on. As for Retro Studios themselves, well, as we know, the secretive Texan team has been working on Metroid Prime 4 and the remaster of the original Metroid Prime. Whether there is the potential, especially as Metroid Prime 4 Beyond is winding down, for them to return to the tropics and do a Donkey Kong as well, remains to be seen. Retro has been expanding significantly, but given the reportedly large scale of Metroid Prime 4, I just don't know how likely it is that they're doing a second game alongside. I suppose the obvious point of comparison here is Next Level Games. Next Level now appears to be the regular developers for Luigi's Mansion titles, having led both Dark Moon and Luigi's Mansion 3. However, that studio isn't full-time on Luigi's Mansion, but alternates with other titles. In between, they produced Metroid Prime Federation Force and Mario Strikers Battle League, and it seems likely, especially given reports that Nintendo is trying to expand the studio to increase Next Level Games' capacity, that they will continue to alternate between Luigi's Mansion titles and other titles. Now, in the case of Metroid Prime 4, it is almost certain that it will be on the new system, at least in some form. The question then is, does the next system need two Metroid Prime titles? Which is to say, should Retro be hurrying along to develop Metroid Prime 5 as soon as they've developed Beyond? Having two titles on one system generally doesn't work especially well for Nintendo for even absolutely massive franchises. Tears of the Kingdom sold absolutely gangbuster numbers obviously, but it's still a long way from Breath of the Wild, which seems to still maintain a higher sales velocity. Super Mario Galaxy 2 is another example where a late-in-life title did relatively poorly, at least by the standards of 3D Mario games. And Ubisoft admitted that Nintendo themselves warned them not to put out another Mario plus Rabbids title on the same system, as they felt that it would do better on the follow-up console, following Nintendo's one game per console strategy. Metroid Prime itself shows precedent in this case, with Metroid Prime 2 and Metroid Other M selling poorly compared to the previous entries on the same consoles, Metroid Prime on GameCube and Metroid Prime 3 on Wii. Now, there are arguments you could make about the relative quality of each in the pair of games, but what you can't say is that Metroid Primes have such extraordinary resilience sales-wise that, like Pokemon, you can crank them out on the regular without too much worry. Yes, there are examples of medium-sized franchises with multiple entries on a recent system, Kirby, Xenoblade, Fire Emblem, all for examples, but all of these have some level of involvement with studios outside Nintendo, though I grant you in the case of Monolith Soft, they're only 4% outside Nintendo. I've covered elsewhere the financial incentives for these franchises to continue at a steady pace, but suffice to say that there are no such incentives existing for Metroid Prime as far as I can see. Just because the first set of titles formed a trilogy does not mean that Beyond is the start of a new Metroid Prime trilogy, and given that Prime games aren't as high selling anyway, it would possibly make sense for Nintendo to wait for a new system before revisiting this franchise. So, if Nintendo decides that Retro, like Next Level Games, should alternate between Metroid Prime and another title, what should that other title be? Clearly, their prior experience on making excellent Donkey Kong Country titles marks them out, but this also creates difficulty. It's impossible to really know how far along Metroid Prime is because even by Nintendo standards, Retro Studios is enormously secretive, but if they started rebooting production in 2018 and worked alongside Iron Galaxy and others on the Metroid Prime Remastered game in this time as well, we're looking at a 6 or so year dev cycle for Metroid Prime 4, plus a couple of side projects in the Tropical Freeze port for Switch and Metroid Prime Remastered. It's a long time, sure, but not beyond imagining for a title of the scope that this game appears to promise, especially if Metroid Prime 4 is being fitted out to benefit new hardware. A Kong platformer might not take quite so long to develop as Metroid Prime 4, though Tropical Freeze took more than 3 years, and that was after far less of a gap. It's also possible to imagine that there's some overlap here between the potential Kong development team and the potential Prime development team, in that we know that the last year of Tears of the Kingdom's development was given over to testing, but quite possibly this did not require such a large team, and similarly, resources may have been transferred to other tasks than Metroid Prime 4 once that game reached a certain tipping point in its production cycle, potentially in 2023, around the time that Metroid Prime Remastered was released. Retro appears to have the standing capacity to have a small secondary team working on ports and remasters. Tropical Freeze is a solo venture, and then the more expansive Metroid Prime Remastered, with the assistance of allies such as Iron Galaxy, prove this. They notably did not take charge of Donkey Kong Country Returns, but perhaps that's because the secondary team is growing somewhat. And of course remember that the Luigi's Mansion 3DS and Luigi's Mansion 2 HD ports were also handled by port studios and not by Nintendo's core teams. Let's look then, by way of comparison, at how Nintendo's Entertainment Planning and Development Group 5 has handled an alternating franchise strategy, in that case with Animal Crossing and Splatoon. I've deep dived this in a separate video, but they started with a strong overlap in staff, particularly art staff, and gradually the teams have become more distinct as both franchises have become independently successful. If a secondary team were making prototypes for a new Donkey Kong title as Metroid Prime 4 was coming in for a landing, it would make a lot of sense as a way to transition over Retro's now seemingly very large standing team of artists to a new product. If we assume production started ramping up in 2023 on a Donkey Kong title, we could be looking at 2026 to 2028 as a release window for a new Donkey Kong Country. We will look at the specifics of what that title could be, but for now, let's stick a pin in Retro and explore who else could be beating their chest for the Great Ape. Of the major teams in contention, surely none are more major than the one other studio with a Kong track record, the Super Mario Odyssey team, EPD8, based in Tokyo. Now, EPD Tokyo is obviously Nintendo's flagship development team, but they have had over 7 years now after Super Mario Odyssey. In that time, yes, they worked on the Bowser's Fury side game for Super Mario 3D World, but generally speaking, they've kept pretty quiet. However, a dev time of this length isn't exactly unprecedented for a AAA flagship game. It took over 6 years for Tears of the Kingdom to come out, and that was a sequel game on the same system using the same world map. If the next Mario title is of comparably massive scale to a Breath of the Wild or Tears of the Kingdom, as seems to be likely for a potential launch game, and given that it's on a new system, it seems to me that a 6 to 8 year development cycle for that game, with all staff on deck except for those kibitzing on Bowser's Fury, well, that's actually kind of a modest shout. Still, the presence of a secondary team, the Bowser's Fury team, does open the potential that the same group could not have folded themselves back into EPD8's mainline Mario staff, but instead continued to develop something independently. Remember, Donkey Kong Jungle Beat began as a small, manageable first title for the innovation-seeking staff who had newly arrived in Tokyo and wanted to get a game under their belts. What if Bowser's Fury had a similar remit? Take a new team, bootstrap them with a small title, in this case a half remake, and then let them cut loose with something entirely new. Here is where Nintendo Software Technology could make sense still as potential partners, because while EPD8 alone might not have the capacity to develop 2 concurrent major scale games, we saw with Nintendo's EPD10, and again I've got a video deep diving the specifics, that by grooming an external team to support development, as EPD10 did with 8ing on Pikmin, it becomes possible to release not one, but both major franchise installments in the series for which they were responsible in a shorter period of time. In EPD10's case, they had both Pikmin 4 and Super Mario Bros. Wonder in 2023, titles which historically they had to alternate between in the past. EPD8 has a long history of second-tier groups working on games such as Captain Toad Treasure Tracker, and of course now Bowser's Fury, but Nintendo's recent expansion must be focused on expanding the remit of their core groups to create games, and so developing this secondary team must surely be quite a big priority for Nintendo. Now, I would issue a word of caution about expecting EPD8 to be in charge of Donkey Kong, even if they do end up with two separate development groups. I know this is the preeminent rumour, and perhaps that rumour is grounded in fact, but from Nintendo's point of view, I don't necessarily think EPD8 are necessarily the best guardians of the Kongs for three particular reasons. Firstly, EPD8's previous Donkey Kong game was not a massive hit. I don't think Nintendo minds its games missing now and then, as they show patience if the ideas are good, but nevertheless, given that there's a diversity of Donkey Kong games to model off, I'm not sure Jungle Beat is the one they will wish to most closely emulate. Secondly, EPD8 is very committed to innovation. When they started, they dearly wished to create original titles and advertise themselves for that purpose. Then Shigeru Miyamoto came in and essentially dared them to make Super Mario Galaxy, and the upshot is that for 2 decades now, they have been the 3D Mario development team. But that doesn't mean that 3D Mario is all they wish to do, or all they're able to do. We know from Nintendo's governance report that they are making new intellectual property. We know from the developer interviews around ARMS that there are many original game pitches that come up at Nintendo's headquarters. And if you're hiring hungry new developers who are interested in Yoshiaki Koizumi's philosophy of thinking of a broader understanding of play than just games as we currently know them, the most obvious path for a spin-off group from EPD8 would be a team that indulges their own creative visions, just as the ARMS team spun off from the Mario Kart group. But the third reason that I think Donkey Kong might be a less likely call for EPD8 is that if Nintendo thinks commercially, the task for the spin-off group should be more obvious: more 3D Mario. Let's say that flagship Mario titles are now going to be modelled on Odyssey, open sandbox adventures of massive scale. These are now going to take years and years to develop, and almost certainly they will be one per console experiences. But while we know Nintendo can go a long time between Marios, we already saw the example of the Super NES having Super Mario World at the beginning of its life, but then a long gap before Yoshi's Island released toward the end of the console's run. Having a slightly steadier pace of Mario titles does still make sense for Nintendo nevertheless. And I would argue that just as the 3D Mario line split from the 2D line to create two separate trajectories for Mario development, we're at the stage where the course-based 3D titles, exemplified particularly by Super Mario 3D World and Super Mario Galaxy 2, are quite separate in style and design from the sandboxy Super Mario Odyssey or Super Mario Sunshine. Nintendo acknowledged this difference themselves in their marketing for Super Mario Odyssey, but the question then becomes, instead of choosing one route, why not choose both? Why not have both a sandbox line of games and a course-based line of titles? Whether this would take the obvious form of a remake of Super Mario Galaxy 2 with a Bowser's Fury style add-on title, or a fully original title for the middle of the next system's life, focusing on Mario, feels like a much more logical and lucrative step for EPD8 to take than another Donkey Kong. But what if Nintendo's Kyoto team just served as a point of contact for another developer? There are lots of studios who could potentially get involved, including teams who have no experience previously with Donkey Kong. Mercury Steam, 18, Grezzo, Mages might seem in retrospect great development partners for Nintendo, but that's not to say that they were very likely in a world where there are dozens of studios who work on Metroidvanias, RPGs, adventure games and so on. Any number of studios are highly skilled at creating top-class platformers. and if one of them made a compelling pitch to Nintendo, we could be off to the races. And Nintendo has motivation to be receptive to overtures from other developers, with Seth Rogen voicing the movie character and Nintendo developing a theme park ride around Donkey Kong, plus the company becoming ever more aware of the potential to monetize its core franchises through merchandise. It must be high on their priorities list to bring back Donkey Kong. Therefore, it feels likely we could be looking at a quite new grouping, either a splinter group within Nintendo's EPD development teams, possibly with a mix of Tokyo and Kyoto staff even, or an external team. There are a few obvious candidates such as Bandai Namco, who have been rather quiet on the Nintendo front since wrapping up on Super Smash Bros. Ultimate, but sometimes these pitches don't come from within but from without. Remember again that Mercury Steam and Mages both pitched Nintendo, reportedly in Mages' case for well over a year, on concepts of them taking command of Metroid and Famicom Detective Club respectively. Could there be similar teams committed to Donkey Kong? I'm not sure it's quite as likely though. Metroid is iconic for its gameplay and its world. It's literally the first half of Metroidvanias. But while Donkey Kong Country games are great, the indie scene for great platformers is pretty diverse, and it's not clear that chasing the Donkey Kong branding would be enormously helpful for an aspiring platformer developer. Perhaps another model is Pikmin 4 or Fire Emblem Three Houses, titles which were developed by, respectively, Nintendo's internal EPD-10 team and Intelligent Systems, but where a very substantial amount of the programming work was supported by key external studios, specifically Eighting and Koei Tecmo respectively. In this way, you could have a skeleton crew within, say, the Mario team at EPD8 leading development, while the bulk of the internal developers train their fire on the next big Mario. Ultimately, with Nintendo, the problem always seems to be matching the project to the people, and if they don't have the right people, the project does not get made. They specifically suggested Advance Wars 2 Way Forward, who wanted to work with them, but at other times, even with Metroid, they've been rather coy about offering their franchises to external partners. I think a lot comes down to the views of senior people on each franchise. Yoshio Sakamoto tried a whole bunch of collaborators on Metroid, from Intelligent Systems back on Super Metroid to Koei Tecmo on Metroid Other M, before eventually Mercury Steam seemed to be a good fit. Small wonder perhaps that he showed some caution in making that arrangement after the previous false starts. But who is the person to Donkey Kong that Sakamoto-san is to 2D Metroid? It's not entirely clear. Shigeru Miyamoto was very involved in Donkey Kong Country Returns and asked Retro Studios to look after the Great Tape, calling him my friend, though Retro games were made under the leadership of Kensuke Tanabe's EPD6 department. Kensuke Tanabe was credited with development support as far back as 1994's Donkey Kong Country, so he doubtless has a wealth of experience to offer. But Tanabe-san is a real everyman of the Nintendo scene, from Paper Mario, Luigi's Mansion and Metroid Prime to now Wario Land and Mario Strikers. He has a massive portfolio of titles he looks after, and I don't know how much a great defender of the property he would be. Still, magic can happen. Mages were a great fit for Famicom Detective Club. Grezzo are back doing wonders on 2D Zelda. Mercury Steam have been amazing for Metroid. Going back, Retro were the right fit for Metroid Prime and for Donkey Kong Country. Nintendo does play matchmaker with their franchises and teams, and it's very much in their interest to do so with Donkey Kong, even if it is a harder nut to crack. There were also people who can do a torch-handing moment, not just Kensuke Tanabe, but his longtime number 2, Risa Tabata. I refer back to 2014's Iwata Ask segment, where Kensuke Tanabe notes that Tabata-san had a good week where she was effectively leading development of the project, saying, "Toward the end of development, I had lower back pain and had to take a week off. During that time, Tabata-san took over everything, and afterward, I continued to have her take on a substantive role in direction. So even during the worst of it, toward the end of development, I think the most demanding requests for changes must have come from her." Risa Tabata has been at Nintendo, and specifically with Entertainment Production Development Group 6, for a very long time, starting as a coordinator on the original GameCube Metroid Prime and having had credits on all the Retro Studios Donkey Kong Country games and remakes. She also took a lead role in interviews explaining the concept behind Paper Mario Color Splash. My hunch is that if they were looking to task someone with resurrecting the Kongs and it wasn't Kensuke Tanabe, it would be someone like Tabata-san, perhaps in conjunction with Kensuke Tanabe at first. And assuming this was an EPD6 project, and assuming that we count out Retro for the time being as potential developers, there is one other team that might make sense and that they work with relatively frequently, that being Next Level Games. Next Level Games, after all, is a Western studio, is expanding significantly after having been bought by Nintendo. They did a great job on the Luigi's Mansion franchise and bringing that back. I think it's very difficult to imagine their next game won't be Luigi's Mansion 4, but if they can grow in scope and scale, I feel there's a strong possibility that they could open their hearts to more Donkey Kong. One of their greatest strengths is in character animation, which would serve Donkey Kong very well indeed, and another of their passions is multiplayer gameplay. This makes less immediate sense for Donkey Kong, but isn't completely off the table either, as all of the Donkey Kong Country games of recent times have involved multiple characters being on screen at once, and while Next Level's focus has tended to be on competitive gameplay, I think there remains a gap in the market for a major co-op platform title as well. Next Level Games seems like a long shot in some respects, but then again, almost all the people identified as potential developers are long shots, so the longer Donkey Kong Country goes without finding the right developer, the stronger the chances are that it could land in the lap of Next Level Games. What about the next generation of Nintendo development staff though? Clearly Nintendo can't rest on the generation that produced Tanabe, Koizumi and Sakamoto indefinitely, and we already see relatively young developers like Mario Kart and ARMS developer Kosuke Yabuki and Super Mario Odyssey's Kenta Motekura staking their claim to Nintendo creative stardom. Here I think there could even be some level of internal tension at Nintendo. We know from Yabuki-san's comments on ARMS that there are teams keen to innovate and drive new franchises, but when EPD Tokyo was setting up with a vision to do something original, Miyamoto-san tugged on their collar and got them to focus on Mario. If a younger team were to create a Donkey Kong game, it's not necessarily the case that they would want to follow the formulas that made Donkey Kong Country work, but rather to innovate around some new ideas and then put it into the Donkey Kong universe if that made the most sense. But if they're slapping Donkey Kong on their gameplay mechanics, why not a more popular set of characters like Mario? In terms of people with reverence for the older games, my hunch is that we're still more likely to see Western developers interested than those in Japan, but I really do think it's an uphill struggle, and Nintendo can be very choosy in terms of who they partner with. They waited 11 years for original 2D Marios and 2D Zeldas to come back. Well, it is roughly 11 years since an original Donkey Kong Country platformer graced a Nintendo system, and at this rate it looks like Donkey Kong could be competing for the 19-year gap between Metroid Fusion and Metroid Dread. And while Dread at least had Yoshio Sakamoto championing it, there doesn't seem to be a similar passion from any one individual for more Donkey Kong. While Nintendo is a company that doesn't purely fixate on sales as the only metric, one consideration must be factored in: the huge sales of the country games, even in Japan, where it racked up 3.25 million of the title's total 9.3 billion sales, were perhaps in some respects a product of their time. For one thing, the franchise platform game was at its zenith as a genre in the early to mid-90s, and while Super Mario World had been absolutely awesome, Nintendo had largely surrendered the recent years at that point to Sega's Sonic the Hedgehog series, with Sonics 1, 2, CD, 3 and Sonic & Knuckles all launching between June 1991 and October 1994. Donkey Kong Country's pre-rendered graphics may look quaint now, but at the time they were absolutely cutting edge, and remember that this was in an era before Nintendo had really managed to codify and vocalize its commitment to a blue ocean approach. At this point, and for a decade longer, they were in the competition for who had the best hardware, and Donkey Kong demonstrated the Super Nintendo Entertainment System could go toe-to-toe with the Sega Mega Drive or Genesis's best efforts like Virtua Racing. But now, mascot platformers are an entirely different matter. Astro Bot wowed, but sales did not seem to match, and while franchises like Kirby and Yoshi have continued, notably Kirby's most recent successful effort of recent years was the 3D Forgotten Land. Mario, of course, remains enormously successful, and Sonic is no slouch, but the gap in the market for a Donkey Kong game, especially in a world where there are so many other challenging platform titles such as Celeste, remains a little murky. What about other formats? Not since Donkey Kong 64 has the Simian Supremo tried a game in 3 dimensions, and if Kirby and the Forgotten Land taught us anything, it's that high-effort 3D platformers can reinvigorate a 2D platforming franchise that seems to have stumbled. The issue with 3D development, of course, is that it's high reward but also high risk. Developing in 3D is more expensive and difficult. There are certain aspects of Kong's gameplay structure that suits 3D more than 2D. The slower pace and the presence of floating jumps and such like certainly make Donkey Kong a more promising fit for 2D than, say, Sonic the Hedgehog, which always struggled with making that jump. Even the barrel blasting segments work perfectly well with changed angles, and of course I don't need to tell any Donkey Kong fan how well the world of colourful and creative Kong characters would suit a gaming environment that can be explored even more fully. Imagine if Nintendo did make the decision to chart the whole of Donkey Kong's islands. If this thought has occurred to fans, I can't imagine it hasn't also occurred to Nintendo, but Nintendo doesn't generally approach development that way, from the outside concept in, but rather they develop strong gameplay mechanics and push outward. The decision to put Zelda as the lead in Echoes of Wisdom was not a founding principle as far as we can tell, but something that made sense after they had first experimented with concepts for the next game. Now, having said that, if there was a strong spark of an idea for a mechanic that would suit 3D Donkey Kong particularly well, I could see Donkey Kong making it big as a 3D title, but my guess is that there's a 70% chance the next Donkey Kong platformer will be primarily 2D, with, at the absolute most, a few odd moments that play around with perspective. Perhaps the only exception to this would be if Retro Studios do indeed take on the mantle of a new Donkey Kong game. After the huge and expansive Metroid Prime 4, all those top-tier developers may well wish to push on with something as massive as a 3D Donkey Kong title, and of course Retro Studios has a history of pitching fan-favourite titles, such as their Star Fox pitch, which does sound like a dream version of Star Fox for fans of that series. Of course, Nintendo might perceive that the rich and wonderful world of Donkey Kong might not be best suited to platformers at all, at least from Nintendo's point of view. They have had a lot of success in recent years putting out Mario RPGs with the Paper Mario, Mario + Rabbids Super Mario RPG, and Mario & Luigi titles all blasting onto Switch, so why not try the same with Donkey Kong? I've investigated separately how the credits for Paper Mario the Origami King and Paper Mario the Thousand Year Door show that there's quite a significant core of people who worked on the 2020 original game but who did not show up to the 2024 Thousand Year Door remake, and while there could be multiple explanations for this, one explanation would be that this team is working on another project. And it strikes me that if you are looking for a logical team to take on a Donkey Kong RPG, Intelligent Systems probably makes sense. This is for a few reasons. Firstly, they have the experience of making RPGs, both Paper Mario and Fire Emblem. Secondly, they do lean into experimentation, as shown with WarioWare and indeed the slightly bonkers array of mechanics that they have tried for Paper Mario over the years. That appetite for innovation probably wasn't fully satiated by a strict Thousand Year Door remake, so going over to Donkey Kong, whose history of bongo bashing innovation offers the potential for original approaches, might make sense. Thirdly though, and perhaps most importantly, is the presence of Kensuke Tanabe and Risa Tabata as key link figures for the Paper Mario team, while also being deeply involved in the history of Donkey Kong Country, all the way back to Kensuke Tanabe being credited on the 1994 original game. Now, I don't necessarily think a Donkey Kong RPG is likely outright. You have to put it as very low odds of any strange twist on a franchise happening, especially what wasn't once but has now become a niche one like Donkey Kong. Nevertheless, if Nintendo were to want to give a bigger focus to Donkey Kong storytelling, and this might be something of interest to them as they consider franchises with narrative potential for movies, Intelligent Systems would probably stand out as a really strong partner. Let's say that the company has a long-term aim to put out a Donkey Kong picture into cinemas in the next 5 to 10 years. They must see that potential after all. In this case, having a strong narrative game in the Donkey Kong series makes sense for two reasons. Firstly, Nintendo will be able to point Illumination to a version of narrative Donkey Kong they're happy with, which hopefully prevents them from going too far off-piste, which would be both creatively problematic and, frankly, quite expensive if Nintendo need to put their hand on the collar and pull them back to something that they see as a better fit for Donkey Kong. Secondly though, as we've seen in recent years, having people come to Mario through a narrative experience seems to help sell Mario titles that also offer a narrative experience. So if people want more Donkey Kong stories, then having a Donkey Kong story-based game would make sense. So yes, a Donkey Kong RPG has low odds in any given year, but by the end of the 2020s, it has to be a 10% chance. And if there is a Donkey Kong RPG, I would say that Intelligent Systems would be the leading candidate to develop for it. But Donkey Kong has a broader range of potential genres to expand into even beyond this. Nintendo's curious reticence with racing titles does not render unlikely a revival of either Diddy Kong Racing or the brilliantly conceived Donkey Kong Racing, a concept abandoned by Rare when they were purchased by Microsoft, where the apes would jump from animal to animal as a racing gimmick. And yet any financial logic must point to the fact that Mario Kart is a huge success, and so there's potential for franchise racers. I know Nintendo doesn't always do what is obvious, but there does seem to be a slight corrective in recent years, perhaps under the leadership of the more accountancy-minded Shuntaro Furukawa, to do the obvious thing and sweat existing assets, rather than always trying to be contrary. Out of Nintendo's non-Mario Kart racing franchises, Wave Race, F-Zero, Excite and Diddy Kong Racing, which one would sell best? Surely it has to be another Diddy Kong. However, financial logic only goes so far. We must never forget that Nintendo's team are primarily creatives, and the thing about Diddy Kong is that it was not initiated by Nintendo. Starting development as Pro Am 64, a racing title using original characters, the decision to put the Kongs front and centre came incredibly late in the day. As a time extension feature reveals, Rare Studio founder Tim Stamper came to the team very late in the dev cycle and said, "We can release this, Kev, but you have to take the tiger out as the main character. It needs to be called something else because if Nintendo are going to shell out a huge marketing budget on it, they have to be sure people will know what it is." But because Nintendo had no ownership over the original creation of Diddy Kong Racing, I think it puts a likely revival for Diddy far below seemingly less financially promising options like Wave Race, F-Zero and even Excite. And of course, Donkey Kong could easily be slotted into any number of game genres for the same reason that Diddy Kong Racing came into being, to give extra sales juice to a title that is promising, but otherwise likely to flounder in the marketplace. In this sense, the sky is the limit on potential Kong projects, including puzzle titles or even beat-em-ups. Perhaps Donkey Kong Warriors by Amiga Force is in the Great Apes' future, but I'm not optimistic on that front. As I've said before, Nintendo simply hasn't used Donkey Kong as a go-to franchise for a long time, and putting Mario's face on a game to boost sales makes much more sense. There seems to be a diminishing return for the other mascot characters after that. Putting Star Fox on Star Fox Adventures or putting the Animal Crossing characters into Animal Crossing Amiibo Festival did not seem to confer the huge sales boosts that we've seen of titles that have entered the Mario oeuvre. So, to break it down, we have a few different possibilities to consider. Does Nintendo want to revive Donkey Kong? Clearly, yes, and I don't think they're against just tasking a team to take the character on. Witness them briefing Goodfield with a task to do a Princess Peach Showtime game. But is Donkey Kong Country specifically, or even a 2D side-scrolling Donkey Kong, something they wish to prioritise? until or unless someone can vocalize some new idea for the franchise, or until a team such as Mercury Steam or Mages with a passion for developing that kind of game comes forward, I think it remains a dicey one. EPD8 remains the most likely candidate in some respects for such a project, but rumours notwithstanding, from an outside perspective I just don't see they're that much more likely than many other potential studios. Retro Studios is another strong possibility, but it really depends on how committed they are to sticking with Metroid Prime for the time being. Then there's the possibility of a 3D game, but given that 3D games take even more time to develop, that Donkey Kong has no particular history with 3D apart from the largely forgotten Donkey Kong 64, and that 3D platformers, despite the acclaim recent games like Astro Bot and Kirby in the Forgotten Land have received, seem to be in relatively short supply at the moment, this seems like an even longer shot. The outside odds of Nintendo wanting to develop something with the Donkey Kong brand, therefore, for release within the next, let's say, 2 years until the end of 2026, has to be about 70%. I don't put it any higher, because we know that they can and do simply wait, even on titles which seem like no-brainers. I mean, 2D Mario has always been a monster seller for them, but they didn't exactly rush to put out Wonder. Granted, that's because the devs are working on the 2 Maker games, but also look at Metroid, Pikmin and others. Long gaps aren't necessarily a bug for Nintendo, but a feature of their fastidiousness in getting something right. Now, if there is a Donkey Kong game within the next 3 years, 70% likelihood would be that it's a 2D platformer. That's always been Nintendo's strongest Donkey Kong hand. It's where there's a solid template for how to do it right, and I guess anybody pitching Nintendo on a Donkey Kong game would probably be using that as their basis. I suspect if there were a Donkey Kong game on the way, one earlier in the life of the next console would make sense, giving it a long time to sell as an evergreen title. Alternatively, I would anticipate that they could try something much more low scale, whether it's another Bongo experience or even a tiny title like a Donkey Kong 99 style event. They may want to keep testing things out with Donkey Kong just to keep the flame of the brand alive without doing too much to push it. Frankly, even if they do develop a platformer, I would still expect something on the modest end, as there's a strong chance it would either be with a new group or a new splinter within an existing group, and historically, as with Donkey Kong Jungle Beat, these teams have taken on smaller scale projects first. Heck, Grezzo, Mercury Steam and Mages all started with remakes, and while the original Donkey Kong Country games did hit Nintendo Switch Online several years ago, I do think those games would suit at the very least a graphical uplift. After all, these titles were not designed to be quaint Super NES retro titles, but they aimed to look at the cutting edge of their generation, and so it only makes sense for Nintendo to remake the graphics to match those lofty aspirations. I would say if there is a new Donkey Kong Country platformer, there has to be a 30% chance that it will be preceded by a remake from a keen but still neophyte studio who hopefully could be guided in the art of how to make Donkey Kong. The question would be, by whom? Basically, I'm not hugely optimistic about Donkey Kong's short-term future. The lack of any obvious studio that can mount a project at scale, or anyone still at Nintendo with deep affinity for and connection to the classic games, makes his future rather murky. Long term though, I think the odds are much better. Kensuke Tanabe and Risa Tabata still make the most sense to me as the link people for a new Donkey Kong project, and Retro Studios still, to me, makes the most sense as a likely developer in the long term, given their track record with the franchise and the fact that it's by no means certain that they will go straight to the next Metroid Prime after having finished on Beyond. And even if they did, as the studio is continuing to expand, and it's very much in Nintendo's interest for them to expand, they are long-time development partners of Kensuke Tanabe, who is perhaps the last person in Nintendo who would be an obvious central figure to corral a new generation of Donkey Kong development. Even Shigeru Miyamoto is quite distant now, focused on Hollywood and his creative fellowship role, and I can't see him swooping in to knock heads together to get some barrel blasting action back, so there is a degree of urgency centered around Tanabe-san's capacity to get the project on its feet. All things considered, if Nintendo continues its current rate of expansion and it continues to be as effective as it has been in recent years at cultivating new partnerships, then I think the long-term prognosis for Donkey Kong is generally good. Whether it's Next Level Games or EPD8 or Retro Studios or 18 or Toze or a splinter group within the current EPD team, Nintendo has people with potential, and it's really a case of choosing their approach very carefully and strategically. If they could push Advance Wars back into the spotlight after such a long gap, I am sure they would want to be equally as pugnacious in pushing forward dear old Donkey Kong. They will just want to choose carefully and only when the time is right, and sadly my hunch is that currently, while he's lots of people's number 2 priority, I can't see that Donkey Kong is anybody's number 1 focus, which perhaps explains why he has been on the back burner for so long. If and when that ever changes, and I believe it will, sooner or later, the jungle could look a lot juicier once again. Thank you for watching, thanks to my patrons, and a shout out to Phantasmal Wolf, who I know has been very keen to see this one. Please do hit the like button for me and check out these videos on screen. Meanwhile, I will see you next time for another Nintendo Forecast.